Great. Thank you all for joining us. We're just going to give everyone a few more minutes to get settled in before we get started. So just bear with us while our attendees join the meeting. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Greg Maley, and I am Associate Director of Digital Products at DAI's Center for Digital Acceleration. Thank you for joining us for this panel on ethics in AI, diversifying data, designers, and decision makers at this year's ICT4D conference. I'm pleased to be joined today by a wonderful panel to discuss some of the promises and challenges of developing and deploying machine learning and artificial intelligence applications for international development projects. While applications of AI are in their early stages, many pilot projects and technology-driven business models demonstrate the potential to benefit underserved populations. However, as with other emerging technologies, these evolving tools represent new ethical challenges, such as threats of algorithmic bias. Joining me today to discuss these challenges and potential solutions are Graciana Fu, data scientist at DAI's Center for Digital Acceleration and author of the recently released paper, Toward Ethical Artificial Intelligence in International Development. Leah Gimple, co-lead of Fair Forward, Artificial Intelligence for All at GIZ, which strives for a more open, inclusive, and sustainable approach to AI on an international level. Dr. Paula Hidalgo Sanchez, Senior Program Manager for Digital Innovation at UN Global Pulse and the UN Secretary General's Initiative on Big Data and AI for Development, Humanitarian Action, and Peace. And Joel Ugh-Borogo, founder and CEO of Sun Health, a technology company that specializes in digital health services and health technology solutions. So thank you all so much for being here today. The format for today will be a panel discussion, but before we get into our discussion questions, I would like to invite each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and their work. We will go alphabetically by last name, so starting with you, Graciana.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for tuning in to just another ICT4D conference. So hello everyone, as Greg mentioned, my name is Graciana Fu, and I am a data scientist with DAI Center for Digital Acceleration. I actually have a background in sociology and health, as well as data science, and I currently provide support across DAI's various projects on everything data related, from setting up data collection systems to conducting applied data analyses, to even using machine learning and natural language processing techniques for project activities. In addition to my more, we'll call it data heavy work, as Greg mentioned, I also recently published a paper on applying ethics for artificial intelligence in international development. And the idea for this paper kind of came about, I'd say last year, when I was noticing just more and more news articles about the harms that artificial intelligence tools were causing. For example, women being excluded from job opportunities because of biased and automated resume tools. People being wrongfully imprisoned due to false matches with facial recognition software. And so it was pretty easy for me to see that with the rise of artificial intelligence applications in development, that the development sector could be subject to the exact same problems that we were already seeing play out in everyday life. I'd say just a couple minute introduction is not enough time to run through the entire paper. So I would very much encourage you all to read it for yourself. But I think one big takeaway that I hope you'll get from the paper, as well as this panel, is that responsible and ethical AI goes really beyond just data. Data is extremely important. Take it from a data scientist that works with data almost every day. But solving data biases won't fix the issue of discrimination and harm caused by artificial intelligence tools. And I hope we'll be able to get more into that discussion throughout the rest of this panel. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Graciana. Leah, may I invite you to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Greg, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the session. My name is Leah Gimpel. I'm the co-lead of the project Fair Forward, Artificial Intelligence for All, which GIZ implements on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany, and which is funded by Germany's National AI Strategy. And I would like to give you a short introduction to Fair Forward and what we are actually working on. The overall aim of Fair Forward is to democratize AI development and to support local AI ecosystems in their capacity to develop local solutions for local challenges. And we do this by focusing on 3 pillars, so basically 3 ingredients to AI development, you can say. The first one is open access to training data and open models. And here we work, for instance, with the Mozilla Common Voice initiative to collect open AI training data in under-resourced languages. We've done so successfully with a local startup in Rwanda, for instance, where we collected data on Kenya, Rwanda. We collected 2,000 hours by now from more than 1,000 speakers. And by now that's the second largest data set on the Common Voice platform beyond English. We also invest in AI skills development and capacity building because we believe that people need the skills, of course, to develop their own solutions. So for instance, we implement AI fellowship programs where we give young people the opportunity to take machine learning courses and then also have a placement in a local company to explore the possibility of using and utilizing machine learning in these local settings. And at the same time, also give entrepreneurs the possibility to explore what machine learning can actually do for their business. And in a third pillar, we are focusing on AI development, AI policy development with a multi-stakeholder approach. So for instance, we advised the government of Rwanda in the development of the national AI policy, and we've been supporting Smart Africa in the development of a national AI blueprint. And I look forward to the discussion and to the points that we are going to dive into.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Hidalgo Sanchez.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Greg, for the presentation, and thank you for the invitation to this ICT4D conference. My name is Paula Hidalgo Sanchez. I'm currently working as Senior Program Manager for UN Global Pulse, that is the UN Secretary General Digital Innovation Lab. I've been working over 20 years as humanitarian and development practitioner, most of these years now and lately focus on digital innovations, and a lot of this work focus on AI. So I have hands-on experience into the development of AI tools for development practice and to developing governance frameworks for the ethical use of these technologies. The work of Global Pulse right now is focused in Africa and supporting the governments of Uganda and the governments of Ghana into the development of these legal frameworks to tackle the ethical questions that AI triggers and that cannot be answered with the existing legal frameworks. This work is supported by the German government and the German cooperation, and it's been supported, it's been really championing this area of work and trusting Global Pulse in the support to governments. In parallel to the development of these frameworks for governance, we're also supporting a concept that is data markets, that is like matchmakers that bring together data providers with data consumers to enable the development of analytics and AI products and services in this country. This is quite an interesting new initiative in its concept, and we're very looking forward to the development. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, on to you, Joel.
Thank you, Greg. Good day to everyone, morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Joel Uborogo. I'm the founder and CEO of Sen Health. Sen Health is a health technology company. And the background of Sen Health is actually strongly technology and strategy based. And I founded the company about 5-6 years ago with a couple of colleagues who are technical and also those in the medical profession. What we do really is development of mobile apps, health mobile apps in particular. And we actually work with organizations, both in the UK, because we're a UK-based company, but also recently in Africa, South Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria. And what we do for those organizations is look at that digital maturity level, improving their transformation process into digital healthcare. So that's the key thing. We're very focused on the patient-centric health. And in addition, I founded the Sen Health Academy. It's a training organization that focuses on training people on health technology. So we have a flagship course, which is Introduction to Health Technology. It covers all areas of technology because the interesting thing about this, Greg, is this. With AI, we look at AI mainly in isolation in some cases when we're having this discussion, but AI is actually underpinned by a number of technologies. So we talk about IT in there, we talk about IoT devices, how you link that and apply machine learning to IoT devices, your health devices and things like that. We talk about even cyber, we talk about blockchain as well, the use of blockchain within health technology. So we cover a wide variety of everything that has to do with health technology, but we're strongly focused on the strategy and making AI work. So we have this training arm, as I said, and we have the arm in which we help organizations upskill their staff and also implement solutions and the governance kind of thing. So that's what we do.
Wonderful. And I really do appreciate that point that so often when we talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, we talk about it sort of as an isolated technology.
Yes,
but in
exactly.
reality, it's built into the fabric of other technologies. And so it's hard to, in practice, really separate them out. And so if I may sort of use that as a way to tee up the first discussion question for today, and it's about the application of machine learning in international development programs and how it can, on one hand, be very helpful, but then this is the big question of the day. How can it be helpful? But then what are some of the challenges and potentially harmful negative effects of using this technology when it is embedded in a program or a technology? And so I'd like to start with Paula, and then we'll go to Graciana and Joel for comments. So Paula, over to you.
Thank you. I think what AI has proved that can do for development practice is the same that it can do for any other practice. It's the same that it can do for businesses, for expansion of businesses. The beauty, the way I see it with these technologies is that there's no difference into north or south or global north or global south. There's no difference anymore. It's very democratic in a way in the terms of its use. Another thing is about the design and the ethical challenges of its use. But in terms of the usability, it's really applicable for everything. And I think what it does is to accelerate processes and make programs more agile. There are many examples of applications. So for applications, for example, in terms of agriculture, how to better detect pests and how to better detect diseases that can be addressed. There are examples about how it can improve the monitoring and counting on the sudden increase of refugee settlements, for example, with satellite imagery. So there are many examples about what it can do. Now the challenge is the misuse, the possible misuse, the potential misuse. There are many stories about, for example, how face detection is being used in different political contexts to identify specific ethnic groups and to even track the movement. We have heard many stories also with COVID and the tracking of COVID contact with COVID patients, etc. So they can be misused related to data privacy and protection. They can be misused in terms of a specific use for harming entire groups of populations or society. So I really think that the benefits and the challenges are just the same. That for any other sector, the question maybe is that development practice and humanitarian practice is only now becoming familiar with this type of technologies and is only becoming familiar with the potential benefits and harms.
Great, thank you very much. Graciana, for additional comment.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think the applications are limitless at this point when the technologies themselves already exist. I would take it a step further and say that it relies heavily on your use case, which I think we talk about a lot in digital development. But for example, I like this example that DAI has done, is that CDA used machine learning on a USAID-funded project in Afghanistan that aimed to bring more women into the workforce. And women submitted their resumes to a job intake application, and then these resumes were then reviewed by human resource staff to match individuals to their appropriate jobs. I think both fortunately and unfortunately for the project staff, they ended up receiving a lot more resumes than they had anticipated and were pretty quickly overwhelmed with reviewing and matching and reading all of these documents. And so we built an ML system that categorized these resumes into just different job titles, like teacher or engineer or scientist, that the project staff then manually went through and reviewed. And so this is a very specific use case, and I feel like, in my opinion, machine learning works really well when you have these specific use cases that are also very low risk and don't exclude the human in the process. So I think our example could have easily turned into something that ended up discriminating against certain women with very specific resumes, but we made some pretty clear decisions to only categorize, to not exclude, to not remove the human from the process. And I think that's really key to thinking about how we can apply machine learning and AI in development projects without doing any more harm.
I think that term, sort of keeping a human in the loop, is one that is more often expressed as important, so that a machine isn't just conducting a set of decisions or making decisions as part of a process without some sort of check. I'd like to kind of turn to you, Joel. I mean, a lot of what you highlighted at the beginning looked at, you talked about the transformation process within institutions. And so, I'd be curious to hear sort of what your reflections are on the sort of the positive and negative consequences of embedding these solutions when you are engaging with these institutions.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, what I see generally, and it doesn't matter if it's actually you're looking at an international setting or a Western country or a low and medium income country, what you find is that it all starts with leadership, right? And at the very top, when you look and when you're having AI being introduced, where there's actually a very visionary leadership and a leadership that understands the capabilities of this technology, then you've actually started on the right note. So one of the key things I've found is that on some of the work we've done, like for instance, there's a use case we're working on just before the pandemic in one of the low and middle income countries, 2 African countries actually. And what we're doing was working on conversational platforms. Now, conversational platforms are chatbots, and we're actually working with AI-powered chatbots to help health community workers when they go out to see patients to triage and take information. But the next step we're thinking of was actually doing it in the local languages for those sort of environments. But the interesting thing is that when you start delving more and more, even when you're doing it in English, first before moving it to the other languages, you start finding out that there's context behind the use of certain words. There's a different feeling, there's a different assumption in slangs in how you translate, and translating from English to another language does not really bode well if you're doing verbatim kind of thing. So you find that you always have to have the right team together. So one of the major gaps I found there is that one of the things we did actually was get an AI ethical specialist who's a PhD holder in ethics of AI to lead in that area, because you have to understand the sensitivity. Because the brilliant thing about AI is that it can do a lot. But we know that AI, we cannot, even though we define the outcome can run away from us. because at the end, as it starts to build, and what now we have narrow AI, but even when you look in the future, we have the AI, it's going to build on that foundation of the narrow AI. So it's very important to get narrow AI on that foundation right. So the key thing we look at is that working with technology projects is a finite, clear deliverable. You have that, you know what will come out. But with AI, things could change. So one of the key things is ensuring that all these nuances are embedded in the development of the algorithm such that we can eliminate bias and put things into context as much as possible. So you find that in LMIC, it's quite difficult to, if you're piggybacking off technology, which has been the case, or international organizations putting in technology and solutions which have worked, you can't really cut and paste AI in that scenario, because in fairness, in most of the Western countries too, AI is still at its infancy in some of the sectors. Like if you look at healthcare, it has gone in few verticals and silos is going, but generally. So my view really is looking at leadership, driving that, looking at a multifunctional, multidisciplinary team, and then also having that kind of understanding and sensitivity about what is the end goal, because it actually can change, and you have to have that agile kind of mindset to it.
Thank you, Joel. And that's a almost perfect segue to the second topic for the day. Before we get into that, I would just like to let all of our attendees know that please do add any questions that you have directly into the chat. We are monitoring that. So feel free to communicate with us directly, and we will do our best to respond before the end of the session. So going into this topic about precision, bringing precision to these algorithms, Joel, you talked about language and the need to ensure that the machine learning algorithms are precise in dialect, in culture.
Exactly.
Leah, this makes me think a lot about the work that you're doing. And so the second topic for today is about development and deployment of these algorithms. What needs to be done to, one, improve the data to train models, and two, to diversify the designers who develop AI systems for these projects. So if we could stick on that first one for a moment, and Leah, turn to you to talk a bit about your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And yeah, I definitely can share some of our experiences working in the field of data, but I also would like to come back to what Krishana said in the beginning, namely that data is, of course, not the only problem we have to tackle. And I hope that we're going to touch upon the other points as well in the course of this discussion. But coming back to the data, I can say something about the work that we did with Common Voice, but I think the first step is always to really think about the target group that you're trying to reach with the product that you're developing. And then think about how these data sets need to be structured, what kind of features do they need to have in order to be representative for the people that you try to serve or to reach with your product. And then another step in this direction is to identify potential impediments to data collection, something that can hinder you to actually collect the data that you identified that you need in order to develop a good product. And in a third step, to develop strategies how to overcome these impediments. And that are basically steps that you need to do before you even collect data. So really think through what you would like to achieve with the solution and who your target group is and how to gather this data. And another important point here as well is infrastructure. So do you have the right infrastructure in place to actually collect the data or to digitize, for instance, already existing data that you would like to use to train your system? And once you have the data, it's important, of course, to check if there are unintended biases in it. And you can use existing frameworks, but you also can use, of course, your own metrics based on the features that you identified for the data sets that you need. And another very important point here is that these data sets are well labeled so that you have good quality metadata for these data sets in order to be able to really check if there are unintended biases in it or not. And another point from the fear-forward experience working on, of course, open AI training data is generally the openness of data sets so that actually the community is able to scrutinize the data as well. And I can give you one example from the work with Common Voice we did, how we dealt actually with bias in the data. Because at some point we realized, based on the data collection events that we held with the startup on the ground in Rwanda, that the data has a bias towards young men. And of course, we would like to develop a data set that is representative of all citizens of Rwanda, including women, including older people. And we have seen this, well, first of all, through the events, who showed up for the event to collect the data, but also going through samples of the data set themselves. And then we discussed this with the local startup and said, well, we have to focus more on women participation in data collection and also to bring older people to these data collection events. And this was a good avenue to actually mitigate this bias. And that's, of course, quite simple. And if you have the right metadata in place, you can, of course, also automate these search for biases in your own data set. I could tell you a bunch of more things about this, but I will leave it at this point.
Could I ask you a follow-up question on that, Leah, about
Sure.
the way that you're handling the data that you are making public? I can imagine the thinking that went into gathering training data and then offering it for others to scrutinize, given that oftentimes when we build these algorithms, you're doing it to make a decision that would be used frequently, and it might even be based on past performance of a human. So how are you handling personally identifiable information in that case? How are you handling data security and sensitivity when you are allowing others to scrutinize the data sets that you are developing for these purposes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, Greg. Well, the Common Voice platform is anonymous, so you don't need to enter any data on your own person when you decide to participate in a data collection event, which in turn means that we are sometimes lacking actually the metadata to, well, really be able to scrutinize based on the metadata what kind of bias we have in the data. So there's basically a trade-off between protecting people's privacy and gathering metadata that would be useful for the project as well. That's something you would need to take into account. And the second step is if you decide to enter your credentials and create an account with the Mozilla Common Voice platform, this is covered by the European General Data Protection because Mozilla is also incorporated in Europe. So there are different measures in place that ensure that the data is safe and secure. One step is also that it's secured, well, on secure servers, of course, in the US, but also in Europe. And that's an important step. And that is actually something we negotiated with the Rwandan government where the data is stored.
Great. I'm sure a lot of thought went into that. I mean, that would require quite a bit of both technology and human touch to make sure that is being done correctly. Paula, if I could turn to you to comment on sort of areas for improvement as we try to build and train models.
Yeah, I think a challenge that we have in terms of the bias that is very much discussed and analyzed is the issue of the profile of the developers behind. As for any research, the researcher is bringing something. If the researcher is going to teach a machine how to interpret the world, the researcher is bringing his own or her own visions on how to interpret the world. So this is a bias that you will have in any type of research or scientific. This is my personal view on this matter. So there's a lot of discussion about the profile of the developers. There are many discussions about the quality of the data, the diversity of the data, but I would also add the quality and the quality control of the data. Machine learning specifically is as good as your training data it is, and I think there is a lack of quality control on the training data. So there are lots of discussions about accountability of the algorithms in that takes into consideration this, but I always bring to the equation a third part, that is the methods. At the end of the day, an AI system, you are teaching a system how to do an analysis on something. Okay, you are teaching it to do a method of analysis, and at the same time, you are creating a method of analysis. If these methods of analysis of reality are coming from a certain part of the world because the data is available, because the researchers have this background, then we are extrapolating methods of analysis to other parts of the world that maybe are not that relevant. And I'm going to give you an example that I commented the other day when we were chatting about this panel. Facebook has made available in its social good program data sets developed for specific, with specific methods for specific purposes. And one example is what they call the Social Connectiveness Index. This is an index that has been created and that is built calculating the number of friendship links of Facebook users between geographic areas. Okay, so it's about connectedness on people based on the friendship links on a specific platform. So without entering into the discussion about who uses Facebook, Facebook is not used, it's used around the world, but it's not used everywhere in the world. Okay, so there are things related to what percentage of the population is using it, what's the profile of the population that is using Facebook. There are differences in rural and urban areas, gender, also male and female use, age groups, etc., etc. There are many issues. The story is about this method is that this connectedness index, I've seen already 2 emails from colleagues sharing this with me saying, Paula, check out the latest social cohesion index developed by Facebook. So imagine, from analyzing and defining a method that is based on relations among friendships, this is extrapolated now by people to more or less is something similar to give me a social cohesion index. I'm sure that those in this call have a much better understanding of what is social cohesion. When you're working, especially in humanitarian assistance on the ground, social cohesion has many different meanings. Okay, so the methods for the AI products are also coming from certain parts of the world because the data is available, because the resources are available, because the researchers are available, and we are extrapolating these methods to other parts of the world. Another quick example on this is the work that has been done with satellite imagery and in computer vision. It's a lot of work done, very, very useful work. So basically with computer vision, you can identify things from satellite imagery that can serve for many purposes. Okay, it can be for humanitarian assistance, it can be for agriculture, as I was mentioning before, etc., etc. Now, again, the methods have been developed in contexts where the data itself and the data is available at a very high resolution. So it's available frequently and it's cheap. These methods are then tried to be extrapolated to other contexts on the world where the satellite imagery either is not available because the satellite doesn't pass through literally that part of the world on a regular basis and it's too expensive. So then we have a great method developed in that part of the world that is just not applicable. I could continue, but I'm going to stop here with the examples.
Great, thank you, Paula. And I would just highlight that on your first point about inclusion, we have a comment here from one of the attendees, from Leila at NetHope, who says that they're exploring practical systemic approaches to intentional inclusion of women and girls as empowered participants across the whole life cycle of an AI and ML project. Empowered participation means a number of things, such as having agency, knowledge, and support to affect change. So, it's obvious that this topic of ensuring that we are not just applying an algorithm or an approach from one side of the world to another side of the world is heavy on people's minds in this conversation today. Continuing on this topic about areas to improve data and design, diversify designers, I'd like to turn to Graciana for your thoughts on this topic.
There's already been so much that has been said. I will try to add something new. I think on the diversification of designers, that's really key to inclusion in AI and ML systems, because at the end of the day, they're the ones making the decisions about the methods and the data and what kind of information is being used to create these tools. They decide whether or not a tool that has been developed in Silicon Valley in the United States, for example, gets used in another part of the world and whether or not that is the most appropriate tool to use. So I think one really key factor for ensuring that we can use AI and machine learning tools in an appropriate manner is making sure that the people that are using it, the people that are being targeted by these tools are actually involved in the process of developing and making these decisions about the tools themselves. I think one organization that I really love to watch is called Masakane, and I think This speaks to a couple of the questions I think that we've already received from some of the audience members. They are a global group of people who are interested in natural language processing, in developing more natural language processing tools and data sets for languages that have historically been underrepresented in NLP tools. So if you look at Google Translate, you'll see English, French, Spanish, some of the more commonly or largely spoken languages around the world there on that platform, but you don't see some of the more indigenous languages, the languages that are spoken by fewer people. Many languages that are spoken on the African continent don't exist on that platform. So this group of people really came together from around the world to develop some of those data sets. And I would say a lot of the people who are involved in that community have no experience with natural language processing, but are native speakers of the languages and are just interested in developing more information so that AI can be applicable in the communities that they live in and they work in. So I think one real key for diversifying the designers and the developers of AI systems is to forget about to forget about a lot of the requirements that we think come with being a data scientist or a developer of artificial intelligence. I think so often we get stuck into, you have to have a PhD or you have to have a master's degree in data science to be able to do this work. And that often poses such a barrier to making progress in spaces like this. And so I would urge people who are working on artificial intelligence tools around the globe to just keep that in mind, that there are no real requirements for doing this kind of work. And there shouldn't be any requirements, because at the end of the day, while I might have some experience in using natural language processing techniques, I have no idea about the nuances of speaking Kinyarwanda, or and that's something that I will never know. So it requires that kind of partnership and relationship building to be able to build something that actually fits the context.
Great, thank you, Graciana. Joel, when we spoke a couple of days ago on this topic of ensuring that models are not being sort of just bounced around the world and applied in ways that weren't thoughtful, you had a lot on this topic. So I'd like to invite you to share your thoughts.
Okay, no, thanks, Greg. No, I think one of the interesting things, and even reading Graciana's paper, there was a very good point she made about the number of pilot projects happening, right? And when I look at the pilots projects happening across Africa and other LMI countries, one of the key things that stand out there is that these pilots are actually quite narrow, right? And you find that if you have so many pilots running in those sort of countries, like maybe about 3,000 odd pilots, there's going to be a duplication of people having the same use case they're working on. So I look at it that there should be more collaboration from that level, but more importantly, how do we ensure that there's actually ownership at LMIC level? We keep talking about how we can partner and work with them, but we're not looking at it that they own how they want AI to be used. It's a very different discussion and a very different variable if, like you're the sponsor, you determine how your vision of your AI initiative should pan out. But for these countries, if they're taking on technology that's been developed elsewhere, but their vision is different from what that AI solution may eventually deliver, then we really have to protect in terms of ethical, in terms of data sets, in terms of training data, and really have a kind of policy and framework, maybe on the regional level to start with. So you're having the low, medium, and income countries, having a kind of body that can really say, okay, these are the commonalities across this area. Or if you're looking at Africa, you could say East Africa, you could say West Africa, you could say Central Africa, that kind of thing. Because what we find is that you're having a situation whereby there's all the goodwill in the world to develop these AI solutions, and you piggyback because of speed. But then again, you pay the price, but you don't know when you pay the price, but you pay the price at some point down the line. And when you pay that price, it's a very heavy price to pay because you have to redevelop the whole thing. There's reputational damage involved, just like when the facial recognition thing that I think one of these, the Apple or Facebook, one of them was doing that went wrong. So I think the key thing we have to look at here when we're looking at AI in terms of international development is empowering, proper empowerment at the level of the countries you're working with, such that we have recognized governance and AI bodies that you engage with, because I believe there are use cases that are common across various industries. So take, for instance, the health sector. We're looking at, one of the things we're looking with AI, and I talked about the conversational chatbot thing, was looking at how do we manage non-communicable diseases. So you're looking at blood pressure readings, you're looking at diabetes readings. If you anonymize the details of the person and you just have things like age, you can create the ML around that. But when you do that in the Western country and you want to take that across on the data to LMIC, the diet, the nutrition, and the social determinants of health create a slightly different stream of how that whole thing pans out. So I think that one of the key things I'm looking at is that if you talk about the code or the premise of the code, it's very good to adopt, but how do we apply the code and the data we apply that code in is very important to be quite careful about that. So I think that it really makes a major game changer if we have ownership and governance within the LMIC, rather than talking about the international organizations developing projects and just going in silos and running these projects. We can never have scale. And really, we have to really realize that most of the AI is quite narrow AI and very infancy. So that's one of the sort of concerns I have. I think that we should have that at a much more visible, recognized bodies in those areas. That's where the focus should be.
Great, thank you, Joel. I think, I'm reflecting a bit on our conversation and some of the questions and comments in the chat. And
Yes.
One of the topics that has been coming up within this group and that I'm seeing recurring in the chat is the need for partnerships and questions about developing partnerships. We have a comment from Ben Mann, who highlights the challenges of working sort of in the humanitarian social sector with nonprofit organizations, and that there's often sort of a lack of awareness on the challenges posed by artificial intelligence. And his question is, have we found success in bringing in partners who aren't as data savvy or mature in building ethical AI and ML activities? We also have a comment, a question from Stephanie about getting local actors to buy in to machine learning tools. And then we have one more comment from Jesus, how the views of the importance of partnerships towards ethical AI in the humanitarian space. So if we could just stick on that for just a moment and talk about specific examples of partnerships that have worked well, efforts that you all have seen to develop partnerships. And Leah, if I could sort of come to you with your first thought on this topic, because I know this is something you think about a lot. So if I may turn over to you.
Yes, thank you, Craig. And yeah, where do I start? Well, let me first begin with the tools that we developed to help local AI developers to deal with these kind of issues. So we started to realize that, as was already mentioned, many of them don't have the sensibility to reflect on certain issues. We found this, for instance, in the gender dimension. And one way to mitigate this for us was to develop gender action plan templates that we were sharing or are sharing with our partners to give them a way and a tool at hand to think about gender inequality, not only in terms of the data that they are collecting as part of the project that we are doing together, but starting actually from team diversity, a point that Paula touched upon as well. And a second initiative that we start is to actually have a pool of experts for gender, for intersectionality, and other aspects where bias could occur, which our partners can tap into and get help from. So basically gives them a capacity program at hand that helps to build the knowledge that is needed in order to reflect and mitigate these kind of biases. But what I also found, coming back to the conversation around we need to work with local communities, is that we also have to look at how to broaden the ecosystem. I mean, working in the NLP field, I of course know Masakane. We are in talks repeatedly with deep learning Indaba, for instance. So some of these networks that pop up every now and then again. And we are also part of the Lacuna Fund, so the fund by Rockefeller Foundation, Google.org, and a few others to basically close data gaps in the global south. And we just funded a huge call on climate data, but have been funding NLP calls as well. And what we basically find is that the usual suspects apply. And the big question is how to actually broaden the ecosystem so that we empower others to apply as well. I mean, there are great universities. We work with Makerere University in Uganda, which I'm sure Paula knows very well, the AI Data Lab. We work with the KNUST University in Ghana and with CMU in Rwanda and many others. But at the end of the day, it's just a few actors that are actually able to respond to these kind of calls. And we need to think about how to build the skills level and the capacity on the ground for local actors to participate more in the space and successfully build their own applications. And when it comes to ownership, for us, it's very important to build all applications that we build on open data sets that we help to collect with local partners. So even if this is more cumbersome, we know that it's the only way for success, given sustainability and given a real impact on local needs, because these are the people who know the local context best. And these are the people who need to build the capacity to govern their own AI systems in the long run.
Great, thank you. I'd like to invite others to comment on this topic of partnerships. Joel, do you have comments on the topic of developing partnerships? I mean, you've touched on this throughout.
Yes, I do have. What I found with partnerships, in my experience, especially working with a couple of organizations, when you're developing projects, is that it really depends there's a power dynamic, right, in every partnership. And what I find when you're having the power dynamic of the funder dictating how things should go or how they should run is a very different thing altogether. One of the key things I would like to see is an assurance function at LMIC level, right? So you're looking at governance and assurance, because by the time, and also in fairness, as Leah mentioned, she's talking about skills. I think there's a skills gap and everything. Upskilling people is very important in technology in general, instead of an isolation of AI, because as I said when we started off, AI doesn't stand alone. But what's important is that if you look at the skills, upskilling and reskilling, and then you look at governance and assurance function, possibly, I'm just thinking out loud here, we should really have a kind of assurance function at an LMIC level that can really start partnering and working independently to act as advisory on both sides. So you almost have almost like a middleman in the sense of it, but really ensuring that the back of the LMI countries developing or actually using data, or how do they go about doing it? Because digitalization is a very main and real challenge. And in most cases, when we talk about AI, we do not realize that most of the organizations that we're seeing, like even the Facebook, the predictors on WhatsApp and all those things, it has taken years to get there and loads of data, big data. So when you're looking at LMIC and you look at it in relation to AI development, the amount of data we have is still very small to get that whole data as we like to. You see, so that's something that I think one should look into.
Others on the topic of partnerships, I'd like to invite any other comments on this topic, because I think this topic of bringing in additional, I mean, Graciana, you commented on the barriers to entry for working in this field, and how if we only look for people who have gotten a degree in statistics or data science, that creates a division between those who are able to participate and who are not. Any other comments on this?
Yeah, I think speaking from a more technical, the data science perspective, I think data scientists need to do a better job of communicating what AI can and cannot do to the folks who are making the decisions and who are funding activities. I think for a very long time, and it still continues, AI is always talked about as this really technical, kind of over people's head, too complicated for the average person to understand. And I think that's not the case at all, but it has led to this, this false belief that AI can do everything and that you just leave it to the technical people to decide what to do. And I think that bridge, that knowledge gap between the folks who are building models and who are working with the data and the people who end up using the AI tool, who are the stakeholders for whatever tool is being made. I think that gap needs to not exist anymore, if I can say that. Because, yeah, I think that is a huge reason why there is a lack of buy-in, why there's a lack of funding, why AI tools end up failing is because there are too many promises made and not enough communication about what a tool can actually do.
Right, exactly. And so it sounds like this education piece, there's obviously a need for more of it. And I think, you know, as somebody who's built models and has worked as a data scientist, you know, I'm aware of the availability of these tools, but I'm sure there are initiatives by international organizations to inform, to invite. And so the last question on this topic that I'd like to go to before we kind of bring the session to a close is about the attempts that international development organizations have made to invite, to create opportunities, like the really tangible, specific examples we can share with the group. Because if we look at the various attempts, Graciana talked about the example with the natural language processing algorithm in Afghanistan. We've talked about collecting data and sharing it publicly. But are there other examples, education examples, any other initiatives that we should share with the group and attempts to mitigate these biases? And Leah, I don't know if I could turn to you to open up any examples from your work.
Yeah, I was just checking my notes, what I can say to this. Well, I think one point is definitely to really look at how to involve people in the design of the machine learning systems, and that's something we already discussed. So one measure that we are currently developing at Fair Forward is to set up an ethical review board with local experts who can actually help us determine if the work that we are doing is well-grounded and is ethical and doesn't have any unintended consequences that we don't see because we are not in their shoes. That is one point, and I think that could apply to many AI projects, actually. So to set up an ethical review group, or however you name it, and thus have some control mechanism to actually look at your work from the outside perspective. And coming back to what I said about the gender action plan template that we shared with the organizations we are working with, the interesting part here was that we also received some pushback on this as well, because we basically did first an assessment of how we deal with gender in all our activities, and also interviewed some of our partners in this regard. And basically some of them said, well, for example, diverse teams, that was not a requirement in your terms of reference. So why are you asking us now about this part? And we basically realized that there's a limited awareness on these topics. And through means like this template that we share, we would like to help people to reflect on these kind of issues. And maybe another word on partnerships. What I really see is that we need more support for universities as well in terms of funding PhD programs, for instance, for ethical AI, funding professorships for ethical AI and machine learning, but also looking at curriculum development and see how we actually can take the experience that we made at universities, for instance, in the global north, in incorporating ethical considerations in computer science education, for instance. And there are already existing efforts. For instance, we are working with the University of Munich and the Knust University in Ghana to do exactly that. So how can we build awareness at a like educational level for these kind of efforts? And of course, this would need to spread also beyond graduates and go into practice as well.
Great, those are really great examples. Paula, I'd like to invite you to share your thoughts on this from the UN Global Pulse perspective. You know, such a large organization with such a big mandate. I'm sure this is something you've come across.
Yeah, partnership has been part of the way of doing work. Let's put it this way, because we've been always advocating for participation. These frontier technologies, the way I see it, is helping us to strengthen business processes or development practice processes, but it's also posing new challenges for us as a whole in humanity. We are talking about serious ethical risks, about harms that can be done and that are actually being done already. We are talking about disruption of electoral processes that are happening on a continuous basis with campaigns on fake news and actors that are using AI to disrupt democratic elections, etc. So the approach we've been having, as I was saying about partnership, is being about convening and giving ownership and inviting people to own these processes and to be part of these processes. The way I see it, ethical AI, it's about governance processes. We've worked with governments, and the way we work with governments was bringing others to the table to work with governments, bringing academia, bringing private sector, civil society, or organizations representing individuals, development partners, anybody interested in the topic. So that's the process that we've been doing, really dialogue, bringing people, making people aware of these processes and inviting people to participate. So partnership is being meant to invite people to participate in the decision-making process. So that's really the approach to, as I was saying, define frameworks to tackle the harms, but also to address the current inequality in the use and access of AI products. I was saying at the beginning that AI can be very democratic in a way that can be applied to any sector anywhere in the world the same way, if the conditions are there, of course, as Leah was mentioning. But at the same time, there is an inequality into the benefits of AI, okay? Because you really need to have certain conditions to adopt an AI technology. So partnership is needed to design things together, but also to govern things, to govern ethical AI by design. We've been talking about the design phase. We've been talking about the profile of the developers. We've been talking about, as Gratiana was saying, including non-data scientists to talk with data scientists and to contextualize the development of the tools. We'll be talking about the data and the methods. This is all ethics by design of AI. Again, people need to be part of it. People that can be represented by NGOs, civil society, or not, or it might not be represented by anybody, but we need to bring people. People are signing on a daily basis, constantly consent when we buy devices, when we buy a SIM card. We are signing on consent on things that we don't even know. We're not even aware of what we are signing, and we are part of a context in the lack of sometimes governance or legislation that is used by other actors. So partnership, yes, for what? To participate in the decision-making processes.
Wonderful, thank you, Paula. We are at time, and so I would like to bring this discussion to a close. And in doing so, I would just like to thank all of you for participating. Thank you, Graciana Fum, Leah Gimple, Dr. Paula Hidalgo Sanchez, and Joel Uboro for joining us today in this wonderful conversation on a very complex topic that I know we all, I'm sure, feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but hopefully it provides some food for thought for our audience. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for all of the attendees and your wonderful questions. And feel free to follow up with any of us through the portal. Please stay and complete the survey that will be shared afterwards. And we hope to see you all next time. Thank you all very, very much.